You walk into networking events and watch others effortlessly connect while you struggle to make meaningful conversations that last beyond small talk. Every interaction feels forced and shallow, leaving you wondering why some people naturally attract friendship and influence while you remain on the outside looking in. Despite your best efforts to be likable and genuine, I am Dale Carnegie, and I spent my life discovering the timeless principles that transform awkward encounters into authentic friendships and turn strangers into allies who genuinely want to help you succeed. What I learned about winning friends will give you the social confidence to connect with anyone, anywhere, even those who seem completely out of your league or social circle. The same principles that helped millions of people break through social barriers and build powerful relationships can work in today's digital age. Whether you're networking for career advancement or simply want to expand your circle of genuine friendships. But first, like this video, subscribe for more relationship wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to transform their social connections. Growing up on a small farm in Maryville, Missouri, I was the awkward kid who tried too hard to fit in and failed spectacularly every time. My father was a debt-ridden farmer who struggled to keep food on our table, and my mother worried constantly about our family's reputation in town. I felt like an outsider from the very beginning, too poor to dress like the other children, too serious to laugh at their jokes, and too desperate for acceptance to realize I was pushing everyone away. I remember my first day at the local one-room schoolhouse when I was 7 years old. I had practiced what I would say to introduce myself, rehearsing lines about how smart I was and how much I knew about farming. When the teacher asked me to stand and tell the class about myself, I launched into a lengthy speech about my superior knowledge of corn cultivation. The other children stared at me with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. Even at 7, I had learned the wrong lesson about making friends. I thought impressing people meant talking about myself. This pattern continued throughout my childhood and into my teenage years. I would enter every social situation armed with facts, opinions, and stories designed to showcase my intelligence and worthiness. I thought if I could just prove how smart, how right, how knowledgeable I was, people would naturally want to be around me. Instead, I became known as the boy who never listened, who always had to have the last word, who made every conversation about himself. When I was 16, I asked Mary Thompson to the church social dance. I had been admiring her from afar for months, convinced that if I could just get her attention, she would see how perfect we were for each other. I spent weeks planning what I would say, how I would impress her with my knowledge of literature and my plans for the future. When I finally approached her after Sunday service, I launched into a rehearsed monologue about my dreams of becoming somebody important, my opinions about the books I had read, and my theories about life. Mary listened politely for about 2 minutes before her eyes glazed over. She made an excuse about helping her mother and walked away. I stood there, confused and hurt, wondering why my carefully prepared presentation had failed. The painful realization hit me years later when I was working as a traveling salesman, failing miserably at connecting with potential customers. I was trying to sell correspondence courses for a company in Nebraska, and I approached every potential client the same way. I had approached Mary Thompson with a lengthy presentation about why I was right and they needed what I had to offer. I was passionate, I was knowledgeable, I was persistent. I was also broke. One evening in a dingy hotel room in Lincoln, Nebraska, after another day of rejection and failure, I sat on the edge of the bed and finally understood the devastating truth. Being right doesn't win friends, and talking about yourself doesn't make people interested in you. All those years, I had been doing everything backwards. I had been trying to prove my worth instead of showing genuine interest in others' worth. I had been trying to impress instead of trying to understand. I had been talking when I should have been listening. That night, I made a decision that would change my entire life. Instead of trying to convince people how wonderful I was, I would discover how wonderful they were. Instead of talking about my interests, I would become genuinely interested in theirs. Instead of seeking to impress, I would seek to understand. It was the beginning of my real education in human relations, education that would eventually help millions of people transform their ability to connect with others. The discovery that changed my entire understanding of human nature happened on a cold Tuesday evening in November 1912, in a basement room at the YMCA in New York City. I had finally convinced them to let me teach a public speaking course, despite my earlier rejections. I was nervous, inexperienced, and desperate to prove myself as an instructor. What I learned that night would become the foundation of everything. I would later teach about winning friends and influencing people. I had prepared a traditional approach to teaching public speaking, focusing on technique, voice projection, and proper posture. But as I looked at the 12 adults who had paid good money to overcome their fear of speaking, I realized something profound. These weren't people who needed to learn how to move their mouths or stand up straight. These were human beings who were terrified of being judged, dismissed, or ridiculed. They needed something far more fundamental than speaking techniques. Needed to feel valued and significant. There was one student in particular who caught my attention that first night. His name was William, a timid bank clerk who trembled every time I called on him. He had signed up for the course because his supervisor had told him his career would stagnate unless he learned to speak up in meetings. During our first session, when I asked each student to introduce themselves, William stammered through 2 sentences about his job and sat down quickly, his face red with embarrassment. Instead of focusing on his technical mistakes as I had planned, I found myself genuinely curious about this man. I asked him to tell us more about his work at the bank, specifically about a challenge he was facing. As William began to describe a complex problem he was trying to solve, something magical happened. His voice grew stronger, his posture straightened, and his eyes lit up. He wasn't just talking about banking, he was sharing something he truly cared about, something where he had genuine expertise and insight. I realized in that moment that I was witnessing the most fundamental human need in action, the deep, universal craving to feel important and valued. William didn't need me to teach him how to speak. He needed me to help him discover that he had something worthwhile to say. When I showed genuine interest in his knowledge and experience, when I made him feel that his insights mattered, he transformed before our eyes from a nervous, stammering clerk into an engaging, confident speaker. This revelation hit me like lightning. Every person carries within them an invisible sign that reads, "Make me feel important." We all have this desperate hunger to matter, to be significant, to know that our thoughts and experiences have value. Most people walk through life feeling overlooked, underappreciated, and insignificant. The person who can genuinely satisfy this hunger, who can make others feel truly important and valued, will find doors opening everywhere they go. I spent the rest of that evening experimenting with this discovery, with each student, instead of focusing on their speaking deficiencies. I focused on finding something genuinely interesting or admirable about their experiences. I asked about their hobbies, their work challenges, their proudest accomplishments. I really listened to their responses and asked follow-up questions that showed I valued what they were sharing. The transformation was remarkable. Students who had entered the room as nervous, self-conscious individuals began to relax, engage, and even laugh. They started asking questions, sharing stories, and supporting each other. The atmosphere changed from one of fear and judgment to one of mutual respect and genuine interest. They weren't just learning to speak in public, they were learning to connect with each other as human beings. By the end of that first class, I knew I had stumbled upon something far more powerful than public speaking techniques. I had discovered the master key to human relations, genuine appreciation and interest in others. This wasn't about manipulation or fake enthusiasm. This was about recognizing the inherent worth and dignity in every person and having the curiosity and compassion to draw it out. From that night forward, I began to study this principle in every interaction. I watched how people responded when I showed genuine interest in their lives, their work, their concerns. I observed the immediate change in their posture, their voice, their entire demeanor when they felt truly heard and valued. I saw how quickly barriers dissolved, and how rapidly trust developed when people felt appreciated for who they truly were. This single insight became the cornerstone of everything I would later teach. Every principle, every technique, every strategy I developed would be built on this fundamental truth. If you want to win friends and influence people, you must first learn to make them feel genuinely important and valued. Everything else flows from this basic understanding of human nature. After years of observing thousands of people in my classes and seminars, I discovered that most social failures can be traced to 3 devastating mistakes that people make without even realizing it. These errors are so common, so seemingly natural, that we commit them instinctively, yet they create invisible barriers that repel potential friends and destroy relationships before they even begin. The first deadly mistake is what I call the impression obsession, the desperate need to prove yourself worthy by showcasing your achievements, knowledge, or status. I see this everywhere, at networking events, dinner parties, even casual conversations. People launch into monologues about their accomplishments, their opinions, their experiences, believing that if they can just demonstrate their value, others will naturally want to connect with them. I learned this lesson painfully during my early days in New York. I attended a literary society meeting, hoping to make connections with educated, cultured people. I had prepared extensively, memorizing quotes from famous authors and developing strong opinions about current books. When the discussion began, I dominated the conversation, eagerly sharing my insights and corrections to others' interpretations. I thought I was impressing everyone with my knowledge and sophistication. Instead, I noticed people gradually stopping their attempts to contribute. Their eyes glazed over when I spoke, and they began having side conversations while I held forth. By the end of the evening, I had spoken more than anyone else, demonstrated superior knowledge on multiple topics, and thoroughly impressed myself. I had also ensured that no one approached me afterward, no one asked for my contact information, and no one seemed genuinely interested in continuing our acquaintance. The cruel irony of the impression obsession is that the harder you try to impress, the less impressive you become. People don't connect with your achievements, they connect with your interest in them. When you're focused on proving your worth, you're not focused on discovering theirs. You become a performer rather than a participant, a lecturer rather than a listener. The second fatal error is the criticism trap. Most people believe that pointing out flaws, offering corrections, or demonstrating superior knowledge will somehow endear them to others. They think that by showing someone their mistakes, they're providing valuable service. In reality, criticism, even when accurate and well-intentioned, creates immediate defensiveness and resentment. I witnessed this tragedy repeatedly in business settings. I remember observing a marketing meeting where James, a talented analyst, systematically demolished every idea his colleagues proposed. He was brilliant, his critiques were valid, and his suggestions were superior. He was also creating enemies with every word. By the end of the meeting, his colleagues had stopped offering ideas entirely. They resented his superior attitude and began excluding him from informal discussions where the real decisions were made. James couldn't understand why. Despite being the smartest person in the room, He was increasingly isolated and overlooked for promotions. He had fallen into the criticism trap, believing that being right was more important than being liked. That logic was more persuasive than diplomacy. He was correct in his analyses, but wrong in his approach to human relations. The third, and perhaps most destructive mistake, is self-centeredness, masquerading as conversation. Most people think they're good conversationalists because they're comfortable talking. They share their experiences, express their opinions, and tell their stories with enthusiasm and eloquence. What they don't realize is that they're having a monologue, not a dialogue. They're talking to people, not with them. I discovered this during a dinner party early in my career. I sat next to a woman who seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say. She asked thoughtful questions about my work, my background, my opinions on various topics. I found myself talking animatedly for nearly 2 hours, feeling intellectually stimulated and socially successful. As the evening ended, I realized something shocking. I knew almost nothing about her. She had skillfully guided the entire conversation to focus on me, and I had eagerly taken the bait. Yet when other guests asked me about her later, I described her as one of the most fascinating, intelligent, and charming people I had ever met. She had won my admiration and friendship not by impressing me with her knowledge or accomplishments, but by showing genuine interest in mine. She understood something I was just beginning to learn. People are most impressed by your interest in them, not your efforts to impress them. These 3 mistakes: trying to impress, criticizing others, and focusing conversations on yourself, create an invisible barrier around you. People sense when you're more interested in showcasing yourself than understanding them. They feel diminished rather than elevated by your presence. They leave interactions feeling drained rather than energized. The tragedy is that most people committing these errors have good intentions. They want to be helpful when they offer criticism. They want to contribute value when they share their knowledge. They want to be interesting when they tell their stories. But good intentions without proper technique often produce the opposite results. The antidote to these mistakes isn't complex, but it requires a fundamental shift in perspective. Instead of trying to prove your worth, seek to discover others' worth. Instead of correcting their errors, appreciate their insights. Instead of talking about yourself, become genuinely interested in them. This shift from self-focus to other focus is the foundation of all successful human relations. When you master this shift, you'll discover something remarkable. People will think you're brilliant because you helped them feel brilliant. They'll consider you fascinating because you were fascinated by them. They'll want to spend time with you because spending time with you makes them feel better about themselves. This is the secret that transforms strangers into friends and turns networking into genuine connection. The moment I truly understood that everyone walks around carrying an invisible sign reading "Make me feel important," everything changed in my approach to human relations. But understanding this principle intellectually and applying it genuinely are 2 entirely different challenges. Learning to become authentically interested in others required me to completely rewire my natural instincts and develop what I now consider the most important skill in human relations. My breakthrough came during a chance encounter with a janitor at the YMCA, where I taught my evening classes. I had passed Henry hundreds of times in the hallways, usually lost in my own thoughts about upcoming lectures or student progress. He was invisible to me, just part of the building's furniture. One evening, running late for class, I dropped my briefcase and papers scattered everywhere. Henry immediately stopped his work and helped me gather everything. Instead of my usual hurried thank you, something made me pause. I looked at Henry, really looked at him for the first time. I noticed his careful attention to detail as he straightened each paper, his genuine concern that nothing was damaged, the pride he took in keeping the building spotless. Instead of rushing off, I asked him about his work, how long he had been with the YMCA, what he enjoyed most about his job. What happened next astonished me. Henry's entire demeanor transformed. His eyes lit up as he told me about his 15 years of service, his system for maintaining the building's cleanliness, his pride in creating a welcoming environment for the students and teachers. He shared stories about watching students overcome their fears in my classes, about the satisfaction he felt knowing his work contributed to their success. For 20 minutes, I listened to one of the most insightful conversations I had ever had about the deeper purpose of our work. From that night forward, Henry and I greeted each other warmly whenever we met. He began sharing observations about students that helped me understand their challenges better. He even stayed late, occasionally to ensure my classroom was perfectly prepared for important presentations. I had gained not just a friend, but an invaluable ally who made my work easier and more effective. This experience taught me that genuine interest cannot be faked or manufactured, must be cultivated through a fundamental shift in how you see other people. I began training myself to look for the fascinating story that every person carries. I developed what I call curiosity consciousness, the habit of approaching every interaction with genuine wonder about the other person's experience, knowledge, and perspective. I started asking myself different questions when I met people. Instead of, how can I impress this person? I asked, what makes this person unique? Instead of, what do I want them to know about me? I wondered, what can I learn from them? Instead of, how can I steer this conversation to my interests? I focused on, what are they passionate about? This shift required developing a systematic approach to discovering what mattered to people. I learned to listen for clues in their language, what made their voice change, what topics energized them, what experiences they returned to repeatedly. I trained myself to ask follow-up questions that demonstrated I was genuinely engaged with their responses, not just waiting for my turn to talk. I discovered that everyone has expertise in something, even if they don't recognize it themselves. The grocery store clerk had fascinating insights into human behavior from observing thousands of customers. The taxi driver possessed encyclopedic knowledge about the city's history and geography. The young mother had developed ingenious problem strategies that could apply to business challenges. When I approached people with genuine curiosity about their knowledge and experience, I found myself in consistently fascinating conversations. But perhaps most importantly, I learned that genuine interest requires emotional investment. You cannot simply ask better questions if you don't genuinely care about the answers. You cannot fake the enthusiasm that comes from discovering something genuinely interesting about another person. This meant I had to expand my definition of what made people fascinating and worthy of attention. I began keeping a mental notebook of interesting details about people I met regularly, not for manipulation, but because these details genuinely mattered to them and therefore should matter to me if I wanted to build authentic relationships. I remembered the secretary's passion for gardening, the security guard's pride in his military service, the restaurant owner's concern for his elderly mother. When I saw these people again, I could ask genuine questions about things that were important to their lives. The results were remarkable. People began seeking me out for conversations. They remembered me warmly and introduced me to their friends and colleagues. They offered help, advice, and opportunities without being asked. Business relationships became personal friendships. Professional networking transformed into genuine community building. What I discovered was that becoming genuinely interested in others is not just a technique for making friends, it's a way of enriching your own life immeasurably. Every person you meet becomes a potential teacher. Each conversation an opportunity to learn something new about life, work, or human nature. Instead of social interactions being a performance where you try to impress others, they become an exploration where you discover the fascinating complexity of human experience. The key is remembering that interest, like respect, must be earned through authentic engagement, People can sense immediately whether your questions come from genuine curiosity or calculated networking. They know instinctively whether you're listening to understand or waiting to respond. They feel the difference between someone who sees them as a means to an end and someone who values them as a unique individual worth knowing. When you master the art of genuine interest, you unlock what I consider the most powerful force in human relations, the ability to make others feel truly seen, heard, and valued. This is the foundation upon which all lasting friendships and influential relationships are built. The most profound lesson I learned about human nature came from an unexpected source: Henry Ford himself. I had been invited to his estate for a dinner party, and I was determined to make a good impression on one of America's most powerful industrialists. I had prepared extensively, researching his business achievements and developing thoughtful questions about automotive manufacturing. What I discovered that evening changed my understanding of what truly matters to people, regardless of their status or success. When I arrived at the Ford estate, I expected to find myself competing for attention with other guests eager to impress the great man. Instead, I found Henry Ford looking somewhat weary and distracted. Throughout the cocktail hour, I watched person after person approach him with elaborate compliments about his business empire, his revolutionary assembly line methods, and his impact on American industry. Ford responded politely but without enthusiasm, his eyes constantly scanning the room as if looking for an escape. When I finally had a moment to speak with him, instead of launching into my prepared remarks about his industrial innovations, I noticed a beautiful antique violin displayed in his study. I asked him about it, genuinely curious about how such a delicate instrument fit into the home of the world's most famous manufacturer. Suddenly, Ford's entire demeanor changed. His eyes lit up, his posture straightened, and his voice became animated in a way I hadn't witnessed all evening. For the next hour, Henry Ford, the man who had revolutionized manufacturing and transformed American society, talked with passionate enthusiasm about his love of traditional music, his collection of antique instruments, and his efforts to preserve American folk dances. He shared stories about hosting square dance competitions at his factories, his belief that traditional music connected people to their cultural roots, and his dream of establishing a museum dedicated to American heritage. What struck me most was not just Ford's passion for this unexpected interest, but the transformation I witnessed in him when someone showed genuine appreciation for something he truly cared about. Here was a man who received daily praise for his business accomplishments, who was constantly celebrated for his industrial genius, who had more money and power than almost anyone alive. Yet what made him feel most valued and understood was sincere interest in his personal passion for preserving American musical traditions. This experience crystallized my understanding of a fundamental truth about human nature. The things people are praised for publicly are often not the things that make them feel most important personally. Everyone, regardless of their achievements or status, has areas of their life where they long for genuine appreciation and understanding. The person who discovers these areas and shows authentic interest becomes incredibly valuable to them. I began studying this phenomenon systematically. I observed that the bank president who received constant recognition for his financial acumen lit up when someone asked about his hobby of breeding orchids. The famous actress who was accustomed to compliments about her beauty and talent became genuinely excited when I inquired about her work with literacy programs for children. The successful attorney who was always praised for his legal victories became most animated when discussing his passion for Civil War history. The pattern was consistent. People crave appreciation, not just for their public accomplishments, but for the parts of themselves that often go unnoticed or undervalued. They want to be seen as complete human beings with diverse interests, concerns, and contributions beyond their most obvious achievements. I learned to distinguish between flattery and genuine appreciation. Flattery is saying what you think people want to hear about themselves. Appreciation is recognizing and acknowledging something genuinely valuable about who they are or what they've done. Flattery feels hollow because it's generic and calculated. Appreciation feels meaningful because it's specific and sincere. During my work with business leaders, I encountered James Morrison, a steel company executive known for his tough, no-nonsense management style. Other consultants approached him with elaborate compliments about his business success and leadership reputation. Instead, I noticed his obvious care for employee safety and asked about the innovative safety programs his company had implemented. Morrison spent 2 hours describing his personal crusade to eliminate workplace accidents, his pride in his company's safety record, and his belief that protecting workers was a moral imperative, not just a business necessity. That conversation led to a consulting relationship that lasted 5 years and a personal friendship that continued until his death. Morrison later told me that in 30 years of business, I was the first consultant who had bothered to ask about what he considered his most important professional achievement: creating a workplace where employees could support their families without risking their lives. The magic of making people feel important lies in understanding that everyone has something they're proud of, something they care deeply about, something that represents their best efforts or highest values. When you discover these areas and show genuine appreciation, you touch something fundamental in human nature: the deep need to matter, to be valued for who you truly are rather than just what you can do. This principle works with equal power in all relationships. I've seen marriages revived when spouses began appreciating each other's unrecognized contributions. I've watched children blossom when teachers noticed their unique talents rather than just their academic performance. I've observed workplace morale transform when managers began acknowledging employees' problem-solving, creativity, rather than just their task completion. The key is developing what I call appreciation consciousness, the habit of actively looking for things to genuinely admire in others. This isn't about finding something, anything, to compliment. It's about training yourself to notice the good that already exists in people and having the courage and compassion to acknowledge it sincerely. When you master this art, you discover something remarkable. Making others feel important doesn't diminish your own importance, it multiplies it. People remember those who make them feel valued, seek their company, trust their judgment, and look for ways to reciprocate their kindness. You become associated in their minds with positive feelings about themselves, which creates the foundation for all meaningful relationships. The ultimate irony is that by focusing on making others feel important, you become genuinely important to them, not because of what you've achieved or accomplished, but because of how you make them feel about themselves. This is the secret that transforms acquaintances into allies, customers into advocates, and strangers into friends. Nothing makes a person feel more important than hearing their own name spoken with respect and recognition. I learned this lesson through one of the most embarrassing social failures of my adult life, a mistake that taught me why remembering names is perhaps the most fundamental skill in human relations. I was speaking at a business conference in Chicago, and during the reception afterward, I was introduced to about 30 people in rapid succession. Among them was Margaret Wilson, the conference organizer who had been instrumental in bringing me there. She had coordinated every detail of my visit, ensured my presentation went smoothly, and was responsible for my being able to share my message with several hundred business leaders. Later that evening, when I encountered Margaret again across the reception hall, I confidently walked over to thank her for her excellent work. But when I opened my mouth to speak, I realized with horror that I had completely forgotten her name. In my embarrassment, I tried to cover by speaking generally about the wonderful organization without using any names. Margaret's expression changed immediately. The warm smile faded, replaced by a polite but distant professionalism. I could see in her eyes that she felt diminished, unimportant, forgettable. That night, in my hotel room, I reflected on what had happened. Here was a woman who had spent weeks preparing for my visit, who had introduced me proudly to her colleagues, who had made my success possible, and I had essentially told her, through my forgetfulness, that she wasn't important enough for me to remember her name. I had violated one of the most basic forms of human respect. I realized then that a person's name is to them the sweetest and most important sound in any language. It represents their identity, their uniqueness, their individual worth. When you remember someone's name, you're saying, "You matter enough to me that I made the mental effort to retain this fundamental part of who you are." When you forget it, you're communicating the opposite, regardless of your intentions, from that embarrassing experience. I developed a systematic approach to never forgetting a name again. First, I learned the importance of truly hearing the name. When introduced, most people are so focused on making a good impression during introductions that they barely register the other person's name. I trained myself to listen intently when someone said their name, even asking them to repeat it if I didn't hear clearly. Second, I began using the person's name immediately in our conversation. Instead of saying, "Nice to meet you," I would say, "Margaret, it's a pleasure to meet you." This served two purposes. It helped cement the name in my memory, and it gave the person the immediate pleasure of hearing their name spoken with warmth and attention. I also developed the habit of making mental associations between the person's name and something distinctive about them or their interests. When I met Robert Anderson, a banker with a passion for fishing, I connected Robert with Rod and imagined him casting a line. These associations might seem silly, but they provided memory hooks that proved remarkably effective during group conversations. I made a point of using people's names when addressing them or referring to their comments. As Margaret mentioned earlier, or Robert, what's your experience with that? This practice not only helped me remember the names, but made each person feel recognized and valued in the group discussion. The results of this systematic approach were dramatic. People began commenting on how impressed they were that I remembered their names, especially when we met again weeks or months later. They would light up when I greeted them by name, and our conversations immediately became warmer and more personal. I discovered that remembering names creates an instant connection that goes far beyond simple courtesy. When you address someone by name, you're acknowledging their individual identity in a way that generic pleasantries cannot match. You're demonstrating that they made enough of an impression for you to make the mental effort to remember this most basic fact about them. This principle proved especially powerful in business settings. I noticed that executives who made the effort to learn and use employees' names created significantly stronger loyalty and motivation than those who remained distant and impersonal. Workers would go extra miles for managers who knew their names and used them respectfully. I also learned the importance of getting names right. Mispronouncing someone's name, or worse, calling them by the wrong name entirely, can be more damaging than not using their name at all. I began asking people about the correct pronunciation when I was uncertain, and I found that most people appreciated this attention to getting it right rather than being offended by my initial uncertainty. The investment of mental energy required to remember names pays dividends in every area of life. Political leaders who remember constituents' names create deeper loyalty than those who rely on generic campaign rhetoric. Salespeople who remember customers' names build stronger relationships than those who treat everyone anonymously. Teachers who learn students' names quickly create more engaging classroom environments. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that the effort to remember names changes you as a person. It forces you to pay closer attention to others, to value their individual identity, to see them as unique human beings rather than generic faces in a crowd. This shift in attention from yourself to others is the foundation of all genuine human connection. The simple act of remembering and using someone's name is one of the most powerful tools available for making people feel important and valued. It costs nothing but attention, requires no special talent beyond caring enough to make the effort, and creates immediate positive feelings that can last for years. In a world where most people feel overlooked and anonymous, the person who remembers names stands out as someone who truly sees and values others as individuals. The most valuable lesson I ever learned about conversation came from a man who barely said 20 words to me during our entire 3-hour encounter, yet left me thinking. He was one of the most brilliant conversationalists I had ever met. This paradox taught me that the secret to being interesting is being interested, and that great conversationalists are made, not born. I was attending a dinner party in New York, seated next to Dr. Samuel Richardson, a renowned botanist who had recently returned from an expedition to South America. I was excited about the opportunity to learn from someone with such fascinating experiences, and I expected to hear captivating stories about exotic plants and dangerous jungle adventures. Instead, Dr. Richardson began asking me questions about my work in human relations. What started as polite dinner conversation quickly became the most engaging discussion I had experienced in months. He wanted to know about the psychological principles behind public speaking, the common fears people faced when addressing groups, and the techniques I had developed to help people overcome their communication anxieties. What made this conversation extraordinary was not just Dr. Richardson's questions, but the quality of his listening. He leaned forward when I spoke, maintained eye contact, and asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he was not only hearing my words, but understanding their deeper implications. When I mentioned the challenge of helping people overcome stage fright, he asked, "What do you think is the root cause of that fear? Is it really about public speaking, or something deeper?" For 3 hours, I found myself exploring ideas I had never fully articulated before. Dr. Richardson's thoughtful questions pushed me to examine my own methods more critically, to consider connections I hadn't previously noticed, and to think more deeply about the psychological foundations of my work. By the end of the evening, I felt intellectually stimulated, personally valued, and genuinely excited about new directions for my research. Only as we were leaving did I realize something remarkable. I knew almost nothing about Dr. Richardson's botanical work, his South American expedition, or his scientific discoveries. He had skillfully guided the entire conversation to focus on my expertise and interests. Yet when other guests asked me about him later, I described him as one of the most fascinating, insightful, and engaging people I had ever met. This experience revolutionized my understanding of conversation. I had always believed that good conversationalists were people who could talk brilliantly about interesting topics. Dr. Richardson showed me that the most engaging people are those who can draw brilliant conversation out of others. They understand that everyone has expertise, experiences, and insights worth exploring, and they possess the curiosity and skill to uncover these treasures. I began studying this approach systematically, observing how the most popular people at social and business gatherings conducted their conversations. I discovered that they shared several key characteristics. They asked better questions, they listened more intently, and they showed genuine enthusiasm for others' responses. The art of asking better questions became my first focus. Instead of generic inquiries like "How was your day?" I learned to ask specific questions that invited detailed responses. What was the most interesting challenge you faced at work today? Or what's the most surprising thing you've learned about your industry recently? These questions demonstrated genuine interest while giving people permission to share something meaningful. I discovered the power of follow-up questions in keeping conversations flowing naturally. When someone mentioned a work project, I would ask about the most difficult part, the most rewarding aspect, or what they hoped to achieve. When they shared a personal interest, I would inquire about how they got started, what they enjoyed most about it, or what advice they would give to someone just beginning. But perhaps most importantly, I learned that genuine listening requires both mental and emotional engagement. It's not enough to simply hear words while waiting for your turn to speak. True listening means trying to understand not just what someone is saying, but why it matters to them. It means paying attention to their enthusiasm, their concerns, their values, and their perspectives. I practiced what I came to call active curiosity, approaching every conversation with genuine wonder about the other person's experience and knowledge. Instead of thinking about what I wanted to say next, I focused entirely on understanding what they were sharing and exploring it more deeply. This shift in attention transformed my conversations from performances into discoveries. The results were remarkable. People began seeking me out at social events, not because I entertained them with clever stories, but because talking with me made them feel interesting and valuable. Business relationships deepened because clients and colleagues felt heard and understood. Even family conversations became more meaningful when I applied these principles at home. I noticed that when I let others do most of the talking, they remembered our conversations more fondly than when I dominated with my own stories and opinions. They would later refer to insights they had shared with me, as if talking with me had helped them clarify their own thinking. In many cases, they would credit me with helping them solve problems, even though I had simply asked questions that led them to their own solutions. This approach proved especially powerful in business settings. I found that potential clients were far more likely to hire me after conversations where they talked extensively about their challenges and goals than after presentations where I talked about my qualifications and methods. By focusing on understanding their needs rather than impressing them with my expertise, I created the foundation for genuine trust and partnership. The paradox of great conversation is that the person who talks the least often makes the strongest impression. By giving others the gift of your complete attention, by showing genuine interest in their thoughts and experiences, by asking questions that help them explore and articulate their own insights, you become someone they want to talk with again and again. This doesn't mean becoming passive or silent in conversations. It means shifting your focus from being impressive to being impressed, from showcasing your knowledge to discovering theirs, from talking about yourself to learning about them. When you master this shift, you'll find that people consider you one of the most engaging conversationalists they know. Even when you've said remarkably little, the greatest communication breakthrough of my career came when I stopped trying to make my ideas interesting and started making my ideas relevant to what already interested others. This fundamental shift transformed not only my effectiveness as a speaker and teacher, but my ability to connect with people in every area of life. Early in my career, I was invited to speak to a group of railroad executives about the importance of employee relations. I had prepared what I considered a brilliant presentation about the psychological principles of motivation, filled with academic research and theoretical insights. I was excited to share my knowledge with these influential business leaders and confident that my expertise would impress them. The presentation was a disaster. Within 15 minutes, I could see eyes glazing over, people checking their watches, and side conversations beginning. My carefully crafted arguments about human psychology were met with polite but obvious disinterest. These practical men who ran one of America's most important industries had no patience for abstract theories that seemed disconnected from their daily challenges. During the break, I overheard several executives discussing a labor dispute that was threatening to shut down their main freight line. They were genuinely worried about the financial impact, the effect on their customers, and the potential for violence between management and workers. I realized then that while I had been talking about employee relations in general terms, they were facing a specific employee relations crisis that could destroy their company. When I resumed my presentation, I abandoned my prepared remarks entirely. Instead, I began asking questions about their labor situation. What were the workers' main complaints? How had management typically responded to such disputes? What were the financial consequences of work stoppages? As they shared their challenges, I began connecting their specific problems to the psychological principles I understood. The transformation was immediate. These same executives who had been bored by my theoretical presentation became intensely engaged when we discussed how understanding worker psychology could help resolve their actual dispute. They asked detailed questions, shared additional examples, and began developing practical strategies based on the principles we were exploring. What had been a failed lecture became a productive problem-solving session. This experience taught me that people are not interested in abstract ideas. They're interested in ideas that connect to their existing concerns, challenges, and goals. The key to capturing anyone's attention is not to make your message more compelling, but to make it more relevant to what already compels them. I began studying what I called interest alignment, the art of discovering what people already care about and presenting ideas in terms of those existing interests. When speaking to business leaders, I learned to discuss human relations principles in terms of productivity, profit, and competitive advantage. When teaching parents, I framed the same principles in terms of child development and family harmony. When working with educators, I connected these ideas to student engagement and learning outcomes. The principle works because everyone walks around with a mental radio station tuned to WIIFM. What's in it for me? This isn't selfishness, it's human nature. People's attention is naturally drawn to information that seems relevant to their current situation, their goals, their problems, or their interests. When you can connect your message to their existing concerns, you automatically have their attention. I discovered this during a consulting assignment with a manufacturing company that was struggling with employee turnover. The plant manager, Robert Thompson, had initially resisted my suggestions about improving worker relationships, arguing that his job was production, not psychology. His attitude changed completely when I showed him how high turnover was costing his plant over $200,000 annually in recruiting, training, and lost productivity. Suddenly, employee relations wasn't a soft concern, it was a hard business issue that directly affected his most important metrics. We spent the next 2 hours developing specific strategies for reducing turnover by improving how supervisors communicated with workers. Thompson implemented these changes enthusiastically because he could see the direct connection to his operational goals. The same principle applies in personal relationships. I learned that instead of trying to convince my wife to share my interest in public speaking, I should discover how communication skills connected to her interests in community service and social change. When I helped her see how better presentation abilities could amplify her impact on causes she cared about, she became genuinely interested in improving these skills. This approach requires what I call perspective shifting, the ability to see your ideas from the other person's point of view and translate them into their language of interest. It means asking yourself not, why is this important to me, but why would this be important to them? It requires genuine curiosity about what motivates, concerns, and excites the people you're trying to reach. I developed a systematic approach to discovering people's interests and concerns. I learned to listen for what they talked about most enthusiastically, what problems they mentioned repeatedly, what goals they expressed most passionately. I paid attention to their questions, their complaints, and their aspirations. This information became the bridge between my message and their attention. The most powerful application of this principle is in helping people see connections they haven't noticed before. During a speech to a group of engineers, I didn't try to convince them that human relations skills were important. Instead, I helped them discover how many engineering problems are actually people problems in disguise. When they realized that project delays, budget overruns, and technical failures often resulted from communication breakdowns, they became genuinely interested in learning better interpersonal skills. This approach works because it respects people's existing interests rather than trying to replace them. It acknowledges that they have valid reasons for caring about what they care about, and it shows how your ideas can serve their established priorities. Instead of asking people to change their interests, you're showing them how their interests connect to new possibilities. The ultimate goal is not just to capture attention, but to create genuine enthusiasm. When people see how your ideas can help them achieve their goals, solve their problems, or enhance their interests, they don't just listen, they become advocates. They share your ideas with others because those ideas have become personally valuable to them. This principle transforms every interaction from a battle for attention into an opportunity for mutual benefit. Instead of trying to impose your interests on others, you discover how your knowledge and insights can serve their existing interests. This creates the foundation for all persuasive communication and genuine influence. The secret to instant likability revealed itself to me through an encounter with the most naturally magnetic person I ever met, a train conductor named Thomas Mitchell, who transformed my understanding of what draws people to each other immediately and powerfully. I was traveling from New York to Chicago on a business trip, dreading the long journey and feeling particularly irritable after a difficult week of failed negotiations. The train was crowded, the weather was miserable, and my fellow passengers seemed as grumpy and tired as I felt. The atmosphere was thick with the collective mood of people who didn't want to be there, doing something they didn't want to do. Then Thomas Mitchell entered our car to collect tickets, and something magical happened. This middle-aged conductor, with a weathered face and simple uniform, somehow transformed the entire atmosphere of that railway car within minutes. He didn't accomplish this through jokes or entertainment, but through something far more powerful: genuine enthusiasm for meeting every single person on that train. When Thomas approached each passenger, his face lit up with what I can only describe as authentic delight. "Good morning," he would say, with such warmth and energy that you couldn't help but smile back. "I hope you're enjoying your journey today. Where are you headed, and what's taking you there?" He asked these questions not as perfunctory small talk, but as if he were genuinely excited to learn about each person's destination and purpose. I watched in fascination as passenger after passenger responded to his enthusiasm with enthusiasm of their own. The businessman, who had been scowling at his papers, began sharing details about an important presentation he was giving in Chicago. The elderly woman, who had been staring sadly out the window, brightened up while describing her upcoming visit with grandchildren. Even the sullen teenager put down his book to talk about starting college. When Thomas reached me, I experienced the full power of his approach firsthand. Instead of the usual routine interaction I expected, I found myself engaged in a genuinely delightful conversation about my work and the opportunities that lay ahead in Chicago. His enthusiasm was so authentic and infectious that I forgot about my business frustrations and began to feel excited about the possibilities of my trip. What struck me most was that Thomas's enthusiasm wasn't forced or artificial. He seemed genuinely thrilled to meet each person, authentically curious about their stories, and sincerely happy to be part of their journey, even in this small way. His joy was real, and because it was real, it was irresistible. By the end of his pass through our car, the entire atmosphere had changed. Passengers were talking with each other, sharing stories, and laughing together. The same people who had been isolated in their individual miseries were now connected in a shared experience of human warmth. Thomas had created this transformation simply by approaching each interaction with genuine enthusiasm and delight. This experience taught me that enthusiasm is the most contagious emotion in human relations. When you approach people with authentic excitement about meeting them, they cannot help but respond positively. Your enthusiasm becomes their enthusiasm, your energy becomes their energy, and your delight in the interaction becomes their delight. But the key word is authentic. Forced enthusiasm, manufactured excitement, and fake cheerfulness are immediately recognizable and equally repelling. People have an instinctive ability to detect insincerity, and nothing creates faster dislike than obvious phoniness. The enthusiasm must come from a genuine place, real appreciation for the opportunity to connect with another human being. I began experimenting with this principle in my own interactions. Instead of approaching social and business encounters with neutral politeness or professional reserve, I started cultivating genuine excitement about the people I was meeting. I trained myself to find something authentically interesting or valuable about each person, then let that genuine interest fuel natural enthusiasm. The results were remarkable. People began responding to me with warmth and openness that I had never experienced before. Business meetings became more collaborative, social, conversations became more engaging, and even routine interactions like shopping or dining became unexpectedly pleasant. People seemed to enjoy talking with me because I enjoyed talking with them. I discovered that enthusiasm works because it communicates several powerful messages simultaneously. First, it says that you value the interaction, that meeting this person is worth your emotional energy and excitement. Second, it suggests that you see something positive and worthwhile in them that merits your enthusiasm. Third, it creates an immediate atmosphere of positivity that makes the interaction feel good for both people. Enthusiasm also has the power to elevate ordinary moments into memorable experiences. When someone approaches you with genuine excitement about meeting you, even a brief encounter becomes special. You remember not just what was said, but how it felt to be on the receiving end of that authentic positive energy. I learned to pair enthusiasm with what I call presence, the art of being completely present in each interaction rather than thinking about what comes next. When you combine genuine enthusiasm with full attention, you create what people often describe as charisma. You become someone they enjoy being around because being around you makes them feel energized and valued. The physical expression of enthusiasm matters enormously. A genuine smile, one that engages not just your mouth but your eyes instantly, recognizable and irresistibly attractive. Warm eye contact, animated gestures, and an engaged posture all communicate your authentic interest in the interaction. People respond to these signals on an unconscious level, feeling drawn to someone who seems genuinely happy to be with them. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that enthusiasm feeds on itself. The more genuinely excited you become about meeting people and learning about their lives, the more reasons you find to be excited. Each person becomes a potential source of new insights, interesting stories, or unexpected connections. This creates a positive cycle where your increasing enthusiasm for human interaction makes you increasingly attractive to others. The ultimate secret of instant likability is this: people like people who like them. When you approach others with authentic enthusiasm and genuine delight in meeting them, you make them feel immediately valued and appreciated. This positive feeling becomes associated with you in their minds, creating the foundation for all future interactions. This doesn't mean being overwhelmingly energetic or inappropriately familiar. It means bringing a warm, positive attitude to each encounter and letting your genuine interest in others shine through your words, expressions, and energy. When you master this approach, you'll find that people are drawn to you naturally because being around you simply feels good. The most valuable lesson I ever learned about handling disagreements came from watching myself destroy a promising business relationship in less than 10 minutes, all because I couldn't resist the urge to prove that I was right. This painful experience taught me that winning an argument often means losing a friend, and that there are far more effective ways to handle differences of opinion. I was meeting with Charles Henderson, the president of a manufacturing company, who had expressed interest in my training programs for his management team. The discussion was going well until Henderson mentioned his belief that employee motivation was simply a matter of offering higher wages. Pay people enough, he said confidently, and they'll work hard. All this talk about appreciation and recognition is just unnecessary complications. Every instinct in my body screamed to correct him. I had extensive research showing that money was only one factor in employee motivation, and often not the most important one. I had case studies, statistics, and expert testimony that could demolish his simplistic view. So I proceeded to do exactly that, systematically dismantling his position with fact after fact, study after study, until I had thoroughly proven that his understanding of human motivation was completely wrong. Henderson listened to my assault on his opinions with increasing coldness. His posture stiffened, his responses became curt, and his initial enthusiasm for my programs evaporated entirely. By the end of our meeting, he had politely but firmly declined my services. I had won the argument completely and convincingly. I had also lost a client, damaged a potential relationship, and accomplished nothing except making Henderson feel foolish and defensive. That night, reflecting on my Pyrrhic victory, I realized I had fallen into what I now call the rightness trap, the belief that being correct is more important than being effective. I had prioritized proving my intellectual superiority over achieving my actual goal, which was to help Henderson improve his company's management practices. My need to be right had made it impossible for him to be wrong gracefully, and nobody likes to be made to feel stupid. This experience led me to develop what became one of my most important principles. You can't win an argument. If you lose, you lose. If you win, you lose. Because even if you prove your point conclusively, you make the other person feel inferior, humiliated, and resentful. You may win the intellectual battle, but you lose the relationship war. I began studying people who were naturally skilled at handling disagreements without creating animosity. I discovered they shared several key approaches that preserved relationships while still addressing differences of opinion. The first was what I learned to call respectful curiosity, approaching disagreements as opportunities to understand rather than occasions to conquer. When faced with opinions that differed from mine, I trained myself to ask questions instead of making statements. Instead of saying, "You're wrong about employee motivation," I learned to say, "That's interesting. What experiences have led you to that conclusion?" This approach accomplished several things. It showed respect for the other person's thinking process. It gathered information about their perspective, and it avoided the immediate defensiveness that comes from being directly contradicted. I practiced the art of finding common ground before addressing differences. With Henderson, I could have begun by acknowledging that compensation certainly plays an important role in motivation, a point we both agreed on, before exploring other factors that might also matter. This approach makes people feel heard and validated before introducing challenging ideas. Perhaps most importantly, I learned to admit my own mistakes quickly and emphatically when I was wrong. This was initially difficult for my ego, but I discovered it had remarkable power to diffuse tension and build credibility. When you readily acknowledge your errors, people become more willing to consider that they might have made errors too. Your humility gives them permission to be humble. I remember a meeting with Sarah Thompson, a skeptical HR director who challenged my methods aggressively. Instead of defending myself, I said, "You know, Sarah, you're absolutely right to question these approaches. I've made plenty of mistakes in this field, and some techniques I was convinced would work have failed completely. What specific concerns do you have? This admission of fallibility completely changed the dynamic of our conversation from confrontation to a collaboration. I also developed the technique of letting others save face when they changed their positions. Instead of saying, "See, I told you so," when someone came around to my viewpoint, I learned to say things like, "You've raised such good points that I think we've found an even better approach together." This allowed them to feel good about changing their minds rather than foolish about their initial positions. The most powerful tool I discovered was the phrase, "I may be wrong, and frequently am. Let's examine the facts together." This simple statement accomplishes several things. It shows humility, it invites collaboration rather than combat, and it focuses attention on objective evidence rather than personal positions. People can't argue with facts the way they argue with opinions. During a heated discussion about training methodologies with a group of corporate executives, I used this approach when faced with strong opposition to my ideas. "I may be wrong about this," I said, "and I frequently am. But let's look at what happened when companies like yours implemented these approaches." By removing my ego from the equation and focusing on documented results, I transformed the discussion from a defense of my reputation into a practical examination of evidence. I learned that disagreements become destructive when they become personal, when people feel their intelligence or judgment is being attacked. By keeping discussions focused on ideas rather than the people holding them, by showing respect for others' thinking processes, even when disagreeing with their conclusions, and by maintaining genuine curiosity about their perspectives, I found I could address almost any difference of opinion without creating enmity. The goal in handling disagreements is not to avoid them. Differences of opinion are natural and often productive. The goal is to navigate them in ways that preserve and even strengthen relationships while still allowing for meaningful exchange of ideas. When you master this skill, you become someone people trust to disagree with them respectfully, which makes them more willing to share their honest thoughts and consider alternative perspectives. This approach requires genuine humility and authentic respect for others' intelligence, even when you believe they're mistaken. It means valuing relationships more than being right, and understanding that influencing people's thinking is more important than proving your intellectual superiority. When you can disagree without being disagreeable, you open doors to deeper understanding and stronger connections with others. The most profound lesson I learned about changing minds came from watching a master mediator resolve what seemed like an impossible labor dispute using a technique that completely revolutionized my understanding of persuasion. Instead of trying to convince either side they were wrong, he helped them convince themselves they could find a better way forward. The conflict was between the management of a steel mill and a union representing over 3,000 workers. Both sides had entrenched positions, bitter emotions, and seemingly irreconcilable differences. Management insisted they couldn't afford the wage increases the union demanded. The union maintained that workers deserved a fair share of the company's profits. After weeks of failed negotiations, both sides were preparing for a strike that would devastate the local community. I was observing as part of my research into industrial relations when the mediator, Frank Morrison, began what looked like an entirely different approach to the problem. Instead of telling either side what they should do, he began asking questions that led them to examine their own assumptions and explore possibilities they hadn't considered. To management, he said, "You believe the wage increases would be financially devastating. What would have to be true about productivity, efficiency, or market conditions for those increases to actually improve your profitability?" To the union, he asked, "You want workers to share in the company's success. If you were running this business, what would you need to see from workers to justify higher wages? What happened next was remarkable. Instead of defending their positions, both sides began thinking creatively about solutions. Management started exploring ways that higher wages might actually reduce costs through lower turnover, reduced training, expenses, and increased productivity. The union began considering how workers could contribute more value to justify their demands for higher compensation. Morrison never told anyone they were wrong. He never argued for a particular position. Instead, he asked questions that led people to question their own assumptions and discover new possibilities. By the end of 3 days, both sides had developed an innovative agreement that included wage increases tied to productivity improvements, profit sharing based on company performance, and collaborative problem-solving committees. They had convinced themselves to adopt a solution that neither side had initially considered. This experience taught me that people are never convinced by force, but they are often convinced by their own reasoning. The secret to changing minds is not to attack people's conclusions, but to guide them through a thinking process that leads them to different conclusions. When people reach new insights on their own, they don't resist them, they embrace them as their own discoveries. I began applying this principle systematically in my work with business leaders. Instead of telling executives what they should do about employee relations, I learned to ask questions that led them to recognize problems and opportunities they hadn't previously noticed. What patterns do you see in why your best employees leave? Or how do you think your management style affects productivity? These questions prompted self-reflection that was far more powerful than any external advice. The technique I developed became known as Socratic influence, using questions to guide people's thinking rather than statements to direct their behavior. Like the ancient philosopher Socrates, I learned to help people discover truth through their own reasoning rather than accepting it on authority. This approach works because people trust their own conclusions more than anyone else's opinions. During a consulting engagement with a retail chain, I encountered David Patterson, a store manager who was convinced that customer service problems were entirely due to lazy, uncommitted employees. He had requested training that would straighten out his staff and make them work harder. Instead of agreeing to provide that training, I began asking questions about his experiences. "David," I said, "you've been managing people for 15 years. When you think about the employees who exceeded your expectations, what was different about how they were hired, trained, or managed?" As David reflected on this question, he began to realize that his most successful employees had all received more thorough initial training and ongoing support. "What do you think would happen," I continued, "if you provided that same level of support to your current team?" Through this questioning process, David reached his own conclusion that the problem wasn't lazy employees, but inadequate management systems. Because he had discovered this insight himself, he embraced it enthusiastically and completely redesigned his approach to staff development. The transformation in his store's performance was dramatic, and David became one of my strongest advocates because he felt ownership of the solution. I learned that this approach requires genuine curiosity about people's thinking processes and authentic respect for their ability to reach sound conclusions when given proper guidance. You cannot use questions manipulatively to force people toward predetermined answers. They will sense the deception and resist. The questions must be genuine inquiries designed to help people think more clearly about their situations. The most powerful questions are those that help people examine their assumptions, consider alternative perspectives, and explore the consequences of different choices. What would have to be true for that approach to work? How do you think others see this situation? What would happen if we tried a different strategy? These questions open minds without threatening egos. I also discovered the importance of what I call collaborative conclusion. Instead of presenting my ideas as final answers, I learned to present them as possibilities to explore together. I wonder if we might consider Or what do you think about the possibility that These phrases invite joint investigation, rather than demanding acceptance. One of my most successful applications of this principle involved helping a company president, Robert Stevens, address a productivity crisis in his manufacturing plant. Stevens was convinced the solution was stricter supervision and tighter controls. Through careful questioning, I helped him recognize that the productivity problems had actually increased as supervision became more restrictive. Robert, I asked, when you think about times in your own career when you did your best work, what kind of environment brought out your highest performance? As he reflected on this, Stevens realized that he had always performed best when he felt trusted and empowered, not when he was closely monitored. This insight led him to experiment with giving workers more autonomy and responsibility, which produced remarkable improvements in both productivity and morale. The ultimate goal of this approach is not just to change people's minds, but to help them develop better thinking processes. When you guide people through sound reasoning rather than simply providing answers, you improve their ability to make good decisions in future situations. You become a trusted advisor rather than just another person with opinions. This technique requires patience, because people need time to process new ideas and reach their own conclusions. It requires humility, because you must be willing to let others get credit for insights you helped them discover. But it produces lasting change because people implement enthusiastically what they have convinced themselves to believe. When you master the art of helping others convince themselves, you become incredibly influential without ever appearing to be trying to influence anyone. People seek your counsel because conversations with you help them think more clearly about their challenges and opportunities. This is the highest form of persuasion, not changing minds through force, but illuminating truth through guided discovery. The most important lesson I learned about connecting across social differences came from an unlikely friendship that developed between myself and Giuseppe Marinelli, an Italian immigrant who worked as a janitor in the building where I taught my evening classes. This relationship taught me that genuine human connection transcends all artificial barriers when you focus on what unites rather than what divides. I first noticed Giuseppe during my early days at the YMCA, when I was still struggling to establish my credibility as an instructor. He was a quiet man in his 50s, who cleaned the building each evening, going about his work with methodical care, while speaking very little English. Most of the instructors and students barely acknowledged his presence. He was simply part of the background, invisible in the way that service workers often become to the educated professionals who benefit from their labor. One evening, I stayed late to prepare for a particularly challenging class and found myself alone in the building with Giuseppe as he cleaned my classroom. I was feeling discouraged about my teaching and uncertain about my future prospects. Giuseppe noticed my dejected posture and approached me with genuine concern, asking in his broken English if I was okay. Teacher. Something about his sincere worry for my well-being touched me deeply. Here was a man who had every reason to feel invisible and unimportant, yet he was showing genuine care for someone he barely knew. I found myself telling him about my struggles, my fears that I wasn't connecting with my students, my uncertainty about whether I had chosen the right path. Giuseppe listened intently, nodding with understanding, even when my words were clearly beyond his English vocabulary. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, then began telling me about his own journey in halting but heartfelt English mixed with Italian gestures. He had left everything familiar in Italy to provide better opportunities for his children. He worked multiple jobs, saved every penny, and endured the daily humiliation of being treated as inferior because of his accent and occupation. But teacher, he said, his eyes bright with conviction, I watch you with students. You help them find brave inside. This is ... Come see dice. Beautiful work. most important work. He went on to describe specific moments he had observed students who entered my classroom nervous and left with confidence, people who had found their voices through my encouragement. He had been paying attention in ways that even I hadn't fully noticed. That conversation changed my entire perspective, not just about my work, but about the artificial barriers we create between people. Here was a man whom society would consider beneath me, an educated, foreign, working in menial labor. Yet his wisdom about human nature, his understanding of courage and perseverance, his insights into what really mattered in life were profound and transformative. I realized I had been guilty of the same prejudice that kept most people from seeing Giuseppe's true value. From that night forward, Giuseppe and I developed a friendship that enriched both our lives immeasurably. I began learning Italian phrases so we could communicate more easily, and he practiced English by sharing stories about his homeland and his dreams for his children. I discovered he had been a skilled craftsman in Italy, forced to take cleaning jobs in America because his credentials weren't recognized here. His observations about people, gleaned from years of invisibly watching human behavior, were remarkably astute. Giuseppe introduced me to his family, and I was welcomed into a warm, close-knit community that valued relationships, hospitality, and mutual support in ways that put my professional circles to shame. His children, who were excelling in school despite the family's economic struggles, taught me about resilience and determination. His wife, who spoke even less English than Giuseppe, communicated warmth and acceptance through her cooking and caring actions. This friendship taught me that social divides, whether based on education, wealth, nationality, or occupational, largely artificial constructs that blind us to our common humanity. Giuseppe and I shared the same fundamental hopes, fears, and dreams. We both wanted to provide for our families, to make meaningful contributions to the world, to be respected and valued for who we were. We both struggled with self-doubt, celebrated small victories, and found strength in friendship. I began applying this understanding to all my social and professional interactions. When I met wealthy industrialists, I looked for the uncertain human being beneath the successful exterior. When I encountered struggling workers, I sought the wisdom that often comes from facing life's challenges directly. When I spoke with people from different backgrounds, I focused on finding common ground rather than emphasizing differences. This approach proved especially valuable in my consulting work, where I often had to build relationships across significant social and economic divides. During one assignment at a textile factory, I needed to work with both the wealthy owner and the immigrant workers. Instead of treating them as separate groups with irreconcilable interests, I helped both sides recognize their shared investment in the company's success and their mutual dependence on each other's contributions. I learned to check my own prejudices and assumptions at the door of every interaction. When I met someone who seemed different from me, I reminded myself that external differences often mask fundamental similarities. Instead of focusing on what separated us, I actively looked for shared experiences, common challenges, and mutual interests. The key insight was that connection happens at the level of human experience, not social category. A wealthy executive worried about his children's future has more in common with a factory worker concerned about his family than either might realize. A recent immigrant struggling to learn English shares the same fundamental desire for respect and belonging as someone born into privilege. I discovered that people from all backgrounds respond to the same basic human needs: the desire to feel important, to be understood, to have their experiences valued, and to believe their lives matter. When you approach people with genuine curiosity about their individual stories, rather than assumptions based on their social categories, you often find remarkable depths of wisdom, courage, and insight. My friendship with Giuseppe became a model, For countless other relationships that crossed traditional social boundaries, I learned to find mentors and friends among people society told me were beneath my station, and to offer genuine respect and friendship to those society placed above me. These relationships enriched my understanding of human nature and expanded my perspective on what really matters in life. The most profound realization was that building bridges across social divides doesn't require grand gestures or complex strategies. It simply requires seeing people as individuals rather than representatives of their social categories, showing genuine interest in their unique experiences, and treating everyone with the same dignity and respect you want for yourself. When you master this approach, you discover that the world becomes a much richer, more interesting place. Every person becomes a potential teacher, every interaction an opportunity to learn something new about the human experience. You build a network of relationships based not on social utility, but on genuine human connection, creating a more meaningful and fulfilling life, while making the world a slightly more unified place. The most challenging test of my relationship principles came through my interactions with Martin Crawford, a bitter, hostile businessman who seemed determined to make everyone around him miserable. My eventual success in transforming our relationship from mutual antagonism to genuine friendship taught me that there are no truly difficult people, only people dealing with difficult circumstances in the only ways they know how. I first encountered Martin during a business seminar where I was speaking about employee motivation. From the moment I began my presentation, he challenged every point I made with aggressive skepticism and obvious disdain. His questions weren't genuine inquiries, but thinly veiled attacks designed to embarrass me and undermine my credibility. Other attendees began shifting uncomfortably as Martin's hostility filled the room. My initial reaction was defensive anger. Here was someone deliberately trying to sabotage my presentation and damage my professional reputation. Every instinct told me to respond with equal aggression, to put him in his place, to demonstrate that I wouldn't tolerate such disrespectful behavior. But something stopped me, perhaps the memory of my own defensive reactions when I felt threatened, or the recognition that Martin's hostility revealed more about his pain than his character. Instead of fighting back, I tried a different approach. During a break, I approached Martin privately and said, "I can see you have serious concerns about these ideas. With your obvious business experience, I'd value your perspective on what really works in managing people." I genuinely wanted to understand the source of his antagonism rather than simply defend myself against it. Martin's response surprised me. His aggressive facade cracked slightly, and I glimpsed something vulnerable underneath. He told me about a recent business failure where he had trusted employees who subsequently betrayed that trust, leading to financial ruin and personal humiliation. His hostility toward my naive ideas about human relations came from bitter experience with people who had taken advantage of his attempts to be understanding and supportive. This conversation revealed the truth about most difficult people. Their challenging behavior is usually a protective mechanism developed in response to past hurts, disappointments, or fears. Martin wasn't inherently hostile. He was a wounded person who had learned to attack before being attacked, to reject before being rejected, to hurt before being hurt. Understanding this didn't immediately transform our relationship, but it changed my approach completely. Instead of seeing Martin as an enemy to defeat, I began seeing him as a person in pain who needed healing. I stopped taking his attacks personally and started responding to the hurt behind the hostility. When he made cutting remarks, I looked for the fear or disappointment that motivated them. Over several months, I made consistent efforts to demonstrate that I was safe, that I wouldn't take advantage of any vulnerability he showed, wouldn't use his trust against him, and wouldn't abandon him when he dropped his defensive armor. I shared my own business failures and disappointments, showing him that successful people also experience setbacks and betrayals. Gradually, Martin's hostility began to soften. He started asking genuine questions instead of launching attacks. He began sharing insights from his business experience rather than using that experience as ammunition against my ideas. Eventually, he became one of my most valued advisors and closest friends. The transformation was so complete that new acquaintances found it hard to believe he had ever been anything but warm and supportive. This experience taught me a systematic approach to dealing with challenging people. First, I learned to look beyond the difficult behavior to understand its underlying cause. Hostile people are often afraid. Withdrawn people may be protecting themselves from further hurt. Argumentative people might be fighting for respect they feel they've been denied. When you understand the need behind the behavior, you can respond to the need rather than react to the behavior. Second, I discovered the power of refusing to take difficult behavior personally. When someone is hostile or unreasonable, it's usually about their internal struggles, not about you. Their behavior reflects their pain, fear, or frustration, not necessarily their assessment of your worth. This understanding allows you to respond with compassion rather than defensiveness. I also learned the importance of consistency in dealing with difficult people. You cannot win their trust with a single kind. Gesture trust must be built through repeated demonstrations of safety, reliability, and genuine care. Difficult people have often been disappointed by others who started with good intentions but gave up when the relationship required sustained effort. During my work with various organizations, I encountered numerous challenging personalities. The perfectionist who criticized everyone's work, the pessimist who found problems with every solution, the competitor who treated every interaction as a win-lose battle. In each case, I found that patience, understanding, and consistent kindness eventually revealed the human being behind the difficult facade. One particularly memorable case involved Eleanor Williams, a department head known for her sharp tongue and impossible standards. Her staff lived in fear of her criticism, and turnover in her department was the highest in the company. When I was asked to work with her team, Eleanor made it clear that she considered my involvement an insult to her management abilities. Instead of trying to change Eleanor's behavior directly, I began asking about her background and experiences. I discovered that she had risen through the ranks in an era when women had to be twice as good as men to be taken seriously. Her perfectionism and sharp criticism were survival mechanisms she had developed to prove her competence in a hostile environment. Her high standards weren't meant to punish her staff. They were her way of protecting them from the kind of criticism she had faced throughout her career. Once I understood Eleanor's motivation, I could help her see that the business environment had changed and that her protective instincts were now counterproductive. More importantly, I could acknowledge the courage and skill that had brought her success while helping her develop new approaches more suited to current circumstances. Eleanor gradually learned to express her high standards through coaching and development rather than criticism and demands. The key insight is that difficult people rarely wake up deciding to make others miserable. Their challenging behavior usually serves a purpose for them: protection, control, attention, or validation. When you can identify that underlying need and find ways to meet it constructively, the difficult behavior often disappears naturally. This doesn't mean accepting abuse or tolerating genuinely harmful behavior. There are times when you must set firm boundaries and protect yourself from people who are destructive. But more often than not, what appears to be deliberate difficulty is actually a person's clumsy attempt to meet legitimate emotional needs. When you approach difficult people with curiosity rather than judgment, patience rather than frustration, and compassion rather than defensiveness, you often discover remarkable transformations are possible. Some of my strongest friendships and most rewarding relationships began with people others had written off as impossible. The person everyone else avoids might become your most loyal ally when you take the time to understand and address their deeper needs. The most strategic lesson I learned about building relationships came from studying how successful people create networks that amplify their influence and multiply their opportunities. But the breakthrough insight was discovering that the most powerful networks aren't built through calculated networking, they're created by becoming genuinely valuable to others. My understanding of this principle crystallized during a chance encounter with Andrew Carnegie, no relation, the steel magnate who would later inspire my life's work. I met him at a small gathering where I expected to be completely outclassed by the titans of industry in attendance. Instead, I discovered that Carnegie's influence came not from intimidating others with his wealth and power, but from his genuine interest in helping people solve problems and achieve their goals. Throughout the evening, I watched Carnegie connect people with each other based on their mutual needs and interests. He introduced a struggling inventor to a potential investor, connected a railroad executive with a shipping company owner who needed rail transport, and put a young engineer in touch with a construction firm that needed exactly his expertise. Carnegie wasn't trying to benefit directly from these connections. He was simply using his knowledge of people to create value for others. When Carnegie learned about my work in human relations, he immediately began thinking about who in his network might benefit from my services. "You should meet Harold Thompson," he said. "He's building a new manufacturing company and struggling with employee relations. And Sarah Mitchell has been looking for someone to help her train her sales team." Within an hour, Carnegie had provided me with 3 potential clients, not because I had asked for help, but because he naturally thought in terms of how he could assist others. This experience taught me that the most influential people are not those who hoard opportunities for themselves, but those who become known as valuable connectors and problem solvers for others. They build their networks by contributing to the success of everyone in their circle, which creates a powerful reciprocal dynamic where people actively look for ways to help them in return. I began applying this principle systematically to my own relationship building. Instead of approaching networking events with the question, "What can I get from these people?" I started asking, "What value can I provide to them?" This shift in perspective completely transformed my effectiveness at building meaningful professional relationships. During a business conference in Philadelphia, I met Robert Henderson, a young entrepreneur struggling to find investors for his innovative manufacturing process. Instead of trying to impress him with my credentials or sell him my services, I listened carefully to his challenges and began thinking about people in my network who might be able to help. I introduced him to a banker I knew who specialized in industrial financing and connected him with a successful manufacturer who had experience with similar processes. 6 months later, Henderson had successfully launched his company with the help of the connections I had provided. He not only became a client of mine, but actively promoted my services to other entrepreneurs in his industry. More importantly, he began looking for ways to return the favor, introducing me to potential clients and speaking positively about my work wherever he went. I discovered that this approach creates what I call a value multiplication effect. When you help someone succeed, they remember you as instrumental in their success. They become advocates for your work, ambassadors for your reputation, and active partners in creating opportunities for mutual benefit. One genuine act of assistance often generates multiple opportunities through the expanded network of the person you helped. The key insight is that relationships built on mutual value creation are far stronger and more durable than those based purely on social connection or personal chemistry. When someone associates you with their success, when they know you're genuinely interested in their welfare, when they've experienced your willingness to help without immediate expectation of return, they become deeply committed to your success as well. I learned to be systematic about understanding people's challenges, goals, and needs. During conversations, I listened not just for common interests, but for problems I might be able to help solve through my knowledge, experience, or connections. I kept mental notes about what each person in my network was working on, what they needed, and what they could offer to others. This approach required developing what I call connector consciousness, the habit of thinking about how the people you know might benefit from knowing each other. When I met someone facing a particular challenge, I would mentally review my network to identify people who had either solved similar problems or possessed relevant expertise. When I encountered someone with a specific skill or resource, I would think about who in my circle might need exactly what they offered. The results were remarkable. My network began growing exponentially, not through aggressive pursuit of new contacts, but through referrals from people who had benefited from my connections. Business opportunities multiplied as satisfied clients recommended my services to their associates. Professional relationships deepened as people came to see me as someone who genuinely cared about their success rather than just my own advancement. I also discovered the importance of staying connected without being pushy. I developed a system for maintaining relationships that provided value rather than just seeking attention. I would send relevant articles to people based on their interests, make introductions when I saw mutual benefit, and reach out with congratulations on their successes or support during their challenges. One of my most successful networking relationships began when I read about Margaret Collins' promotion to regional sales manager in a trade publication. Instead of immediately trying to sell her my training services, I sent a simple congratulatory note mentioning a challenge she had referenced in the article and offering to introduce her to someone who had solved a similar problem. This small gesture led to a conversation that eventually resulted in a major consulting contract and a friendship that lasted decades. The ultimate secret of building a powerful circle of influence is understanding that influence flows to those who influence others positively. When you become known as someone who helps people succeed, who connects others with opportunities, who contributes to the achievement of their goals, people naturally want to reciprocate. They begin thinking of ways to help you, recommending your services, and including you in opportunities they encounter. This approach requires genuine care for others, success, and the patience to build relationships over time rather than expecting immediate returns. But it creates a network that becomes increasingly valuable with time, as the people you've helped advance in their own careers and gain greater ability to provide opportunities in return. The most powerful part of this strategy is that it's completely sustainable and scalable. The more you help others, the more people want to help you. The more connections you make for others, the more people think of you when they encounter opportunities. The more you contribute to others' success, the more invested they become in yours. When you master this approach to relationship building, you create something far more valuable than a contact list. You build a community of mutual supporters who are genuinely committed to each other's success. This becomes a source not just of business opportunities, but of personal fulfillment, as you experience the deep satisfaction that comes from contributing meaningfully to others' achievements while building lasting friendships based on mutual value creation. While I never lived to see the digital revolution that would transform human communication, the fundamental principles I discovered about winning friends and influencing people remain as powerful today as they were in my era. In fact, I believe these principles have become even more critical in an age where technology often creates barriers to genuine human connection rather than bridges. The challenge I observe in modern communication is that digital tools, despite their remarkable capabilities, can actually make it harder to apply the basic principles of human relations. When people interact through screens rather than face-to-face, when they communicate through brief text messages rather than extended conversations, When they build relationships through social media profiles rather than personal encounters, they often lose touch with the fundamental human needs that drive all meaningful connection. The first principle that becomes even more important in digital communication is the need to make others feel genuinely important and valued. In my era, people received personal letters written by hand, face-to-face conversations that demanded full attention, and interactions that naturally conveyed respect and consideration. Today, people are bombarded with impersonal communications, automated messages, and interactions that feel rushed and superficial. This creates an enormous opportunity for anyone who chooses to apply genuine human relations principles to digital communication. When you take the time to write a thoughtful email that shows you understand someone's specific situation, when you make a phone call instead of sending a text for important conversations, when you use video calls to create more personal connections, you stand out dramatically from the flood of impersonal digital noise. I've observed that the most successful modern professionals are those who use technology to enhance rather than replace genuine human connection. They understand that social media platforms are tools for discovering what matters to people, not substitutes for showing authentic interest. They use email to schedule meaningful conversations, rather than trying to conduct complex discussions through written messages. They leverage digital tools to research people's backgrounds and interests before meeting them, allowing for more informed and engaging personal interactions. The principle of remembering names becomes even more powerful in the digital age, where people often feel anonymous and overlooked in vast online networks. When someone takes the time to personalize digital communications, to reference previous conversations, to acknowledge individual achievements and milestones, they create connection that transcends the medium. I've noticed that the art of being a great conversationalist by listening more than talking translates perfectly to digital environments. The most engaging people on social media are not those who constantly broadcast their own thoughts and achievements, but those who ask thoughtful questions, respond meaningfully to others' posts, and use their platforms to highlight and celebrate others' accomplishments. The challenge of handling disagreements without making enemies becomes especially critical in digital communication, where the absence of facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language makes it easy for misunderstandings to escalate into conflicts. The principles I developed for respectful disagreement, showing curiosity rather than judgment, finding common ground before addressing differences, admitting mistakes quickly become essential skills for anyone who wants to maintain relationships while navigating the often contentious world of online communication. Perhaps most importantly, the fundamental insight that people crave genuine appreciation and recognition remains as true today as ever. In fact, the public nature of many digital platforms creates new opportunities to make people feel important through public acknowledgement, thoughtful responses to their content, and visible appreciation for their contributions. The key is remembering that behind every digital interaction is a human being with the same fundamental needs for connection, respect, and significance that have driven human behavior throughout history. Technology changes the medium, but not the message. People still want to feel heard, valued, and understood. The most successful approach to digital relationship building is to use technology as a tool for discovering how to serve others' interests and needs, then applying timeless human relations principles through whatever medium allows for the most genuine connection. Sometimes this means choosing a phone call over an email, a personal visit over a video conference, or a handwritten note over a digital message. The danger of digital communication is not the technology itself, but the temptation to let efficiency replace effectiveness, to prioritize speed over sincerity, to choose convenience over genuine care. When you resist these temptations, and commit to applying authentic human relations principles regardless of the medium, you create connections that stand out powerfully in an increasingly impersonal digital world. The ultimate test of any communication, whether digital or face-to-face, remains the same. Does it make the other person feel more important, more understood, and more valued? When you can answer yes to this question, regardless of the technology involved, you're applying the timeless principles that create lasting friendships and genuine influence in any era. After decades of studying human relations and helping thousands of people transform their ability to connect with others, I've learned that knowledge without application is worthless. The principles I've shared with you are not merely interesting concepts to understand, they are practical tools that must be used consistently to create lasting change in your relationships and influence. The most important lesson I learned about implementing these principles came from my own struggles to apply them consistently. Even after discovering the power of genuine interest in others, I found myself falling back into old patterns of self-centeredness during stressful periods. Even after understanding the importance of making others feel important, I would sometimes revert to trying to impress people with my own accomplishments when I felt insecure. This taught me that developing mastery in human relations requires the same systematic approach as developing any other skill. You must practice deliberately, monitor your progress carefully, and continuously refine your technique based on results. Most importantly, you must commit to the long-term process of transformation rather than expecting immediate perfection. I developed what I call the daily relationship discipline, a systematic approach to practicing these principles until they become natural habits rather than conscious techniques. Each morning, I would review the key principles and set specific intentions for how I would apply them throughout the day. Each evening, I would reflect on my interactions and evaluate how well I had demonstrated genuine interest, made others feel important, and contributed to their success. The first element of effective practice is starting small and building momentum. Rather than trying to transform all your relationships simultaneously, choose one principle and focus on applying it consistently for 30 days. For example, spend a month focused entirely on becoming genuinely interested in others. Make this your primary goal in every conversation, every meeting, every social interaction. During this focused practice period, pay attention to how people respond when you show authentic curiosity about their experiences, challenges, and interests. Notice how conversations change when you ask follow-up questions that demonstrate you're genuinely engaged with their responses. Observe how relationships deepen when people feel heard and understood rather than judged or ignored. After 30 days of concentrated practice with one principle, add another. Perhaps focus on remembering and using people's names, or on finding genuine reasons to appreciate and acknowledge others' contributions. The key is building these habits one at a time until they become automatic responses rather than conscious efforts. I learned the importance of what I call relationship journaling, keeping track of important details about the people in your life. This isn't about manipulation or calculated networking, but about demonstrating genuine care through thoughtful attention to what matters to others. When you remember someone's concern about their child's college decision, their excitement about a new business venture, or their worry about an aging parent, you show that they matter enough to you to retain these personal details. The most critical aspect of developing these skills is maintaining authenticity throughout the learning process. These principles only work when they flow from genuine care for others, well-being, and success. If you try to use them as manipulation techniques to get what you want from people, they will backfire spectacularly. People have an intuitive ability to detect insincerity, and nothing destroys relationships faster than the discovery that someone's apparent interest was actually calculated self-interest. I developed several ways to monitor my own authenticity. Before each important interaction, I would ask myself, am I approaching this person with genuine care for their well-being, or am I primarily focused on what I can get from them? During conversations, I would check my internal motivation. Am I asking this question because I'm truly curious about their answer, or because I'm trying to steer the conversation toward my own interests? The most powerful progress indicator is observing how people respond to you over time. As you become more skilled at applying these principles authentically, you'll notice that people seek out your company more often, share more personal information with you, ask for your advice more frequently, and recommend you to others more enthusiastically. These changes in their behavior reflect the deeper changes happening in your relationships. One of the most common mistakes I observed in people trying to apply these principles is expecting immediate, dramatic results. Relationship building is a gradual process that requires patience and persistence. Trust develops slowly, influence grows incrementally, and friendships deepen through accumulated positive experiences over time. I recommend setting realistic expectations and celebrating small victories. When someone remembers a conversation you had weeks earlier, that's progress. When a colleague seeks your opinion on a decision, that's evidence of growing influence. When an acquaintance introduces you warmly to their friends, that's proof that your relationship skills are developing. The ultimate goal is not to become a perfect practitioner of these principles, but to become a consistently improving one. I continued learning and refining my approach to human relations until the end of my life, discovering new insights and applications through every interaction. The journey of becoming more effective at winning friends and influencing people is a lifelong adventure that enriches not only your relationships, but your understanding of human nature itself. Your success in applying these principles will depend not on your natural personality or social background, but on your commitment to consistent practice and continuous improvement. Every person you meet becomes an opportunity to practice genuine interest, authentic appreciation, and helpful contribution to their success. Every conversation becomes a chance to improve your listening skills, your ability to make others feel important, and your capacity to find common ground. The most rewarding aspect of mastering these principles is that they create a positive cycle that becomes easier and more natural over time. As you become more skilled at making others feel valued and understood, you'll find that people are more eager to spend time with you, more willing to help you achieve your goals, and more interested in contributing to your success. This creates a mutually beneficial dynamic that enhances every area of your life while making the world a slightly more connected and compassionate place. Start today. Choose one person in your life and commit to applying one principle consistently in your interactions with them. Pay attention to the results, refine your approach based on their responses, and gradually expand your practice to include more people and more principles. The journey of 1,000 meaningful relationships begins with a single genuine conversation. As I reflect on a lifetime dedicated to understanding and teaching the principles of human relations, I'm struck by a profound truth. The greatest achievements in life are not measured by what you accumulate for yourself, but by the connections you create and the positive impact you have on others' ability to connect with each other. When I began this journey as a struggling young man on a Missouri farm, I had no idea that my desperate need to overcome social awkwardness would eventually help millions of people transform their relationships and their lives. I was simply trying to solve my own problems with human connection, driven by the painful recognition that my success and happiness depended on my ability to work effectively with others. What I discovered along the way changed not only my understanding of human nature, but my entire philosophy about what makes life meaningful. The principles I've shared with you showing genuine interest in others, making people feel important, listening more than talking, finding common ground, handling disagreements gracefully, not just techniques for social success. They are the foundation of a life lived in meaningful connection with our fellow human beings. The most profound lesson I learned is that when you dedicate yourself to helping others feel valued, understood, and appreciated, you create something far more valuable than personal success. You contribute to a more connected, compassionate world where people treat each other with dignity and respect. Every person who learns to apply these principles becomes a positive force in their community, creating ripple effects that extend far beyond what any individual can measure. Think about the thousands of students who attended my classes over the years, many of whom went on to teach these principles to others. I remember William, the shy bank clerk who became a confident leader, and Margaret, the conference organizer, whose warmth opened doors I never expected. I recall the business leaders who transformed their organizations by learning to treat employees as valued human beings rather than interchangeable resources. I think of Giuseppe, my Italian friend whose wisdom about human nature transcended language barriers and social differences. Each of these transformations created additional transformations as people passed on what they had learned through their own improved relationships. The shy student who gained confidence in my class went on to become a more effective leader. The harsh supervisor who learned to appreciate his workers created a more positive workplace that affected dozens of families. The struggling salesperson who discovered the power of genuine interest in customers built a successful business that provided opportunities for others. This is the true legacy of learning to win friends and influence people, not just the improvement in your own life, but the positive impact you have on everyone you encounter when you treat them with genuine respect, interest, and appreciation. When you master these principles, you become part of a chain of positive influence that extends far beyond your direct relationships. I've watched my teachings spread across industries, continents, and generations, from the factory floors where supervisors learned to appreciate their workers, to the corporate boardrooms where executives discovered the power of genuine listening, to the family dinner tables where parents began really hearing their children. Principles remain constant because human nature remains constant. The choice you face is the same choice I faced as a young man. Will you continue to struggle with relationships, feeling isolated and misunderstood? Or will you commit to learning and applying the principles that create genuine human connection? Will you remain focused primarily on your own interests and needs? Or will you discover the profound satisfaction that comes from contributing to others' success and happiness? I want you to know that this choice will determine not only your own success and fulfillment, but your contribution to making the world a better place. Every time you show genuine interest in another person, you combat the epidemic of loneliness and isolation that affects so many people. Every time you make someone feel important and valued, you strengthen their confidence and their ability to contribute positively to others' lives. The principles I've shared with you are not just personal development tools, they are instruments of social healing. In a world that often emphasizes differences over similarities, the ability to find common ground and treat others with respect becomes more valuable than ever. Whether you're navigating workplace relationships, building friendships, or strengthening family bonds, these timeless truths about human nature will serve you well as you begin applying these principles in your own life. Remember that mastery comes through consistent practice, not perfect performance. There will be times when you forget to show interest in others, when you fall back into trying to impress rather than understand, when you react defensively instead of responding with curiosity. I made these same mistakes countless times. They are part of the learning process, not evidence that the principles don't work. What matters is your commitment to continuous improvement and your dedication to treating every person you encounter as someone worthy of respect, interest, and appreciation. When you maintain this commitment, you join a tradition of people who have chosen to make positive human connection their life's work, regardless of their profession or circumstances. My final words to you are these. May you discover, as I did, that a life dedicated to understanding and serving others is not a sacrifice of your own interests, but the fulfillment of your deepest human need for meaningful connection. May you find that helping others feel important makes your own life significant. May you experience the joy that comes from building bridges between people and creating harmony where there was once conflict. The world needs people who understand these principles and apply them consistently. You have the opportunity to be one of these people, to carry forward the tradition of positive human relations, and to leave the world a more connected place than you found it. Remember the friends you thought you'd never have, and help others. Discover the same possibilities in their own lives. The choice is yours. The time is now. The impact is unlimited.